My own dad looked me in the eye and screamed that I was a liability. He threw my suitcase into the rain and told me to take my pregnancy and get out. 9 years later, my lawyer called me to say, "Ma'am, your father is in the boardroom waiting for the new owner to save his company." I smiled and said, "Let him wait." He kept me waiting in the rain for 9 years. I am Aaliyah, 28 years old, and revenge is a dish best served with a side of acquisition papers. Watching the high-definition security feed from my corner office, I see a man pacing back and forth in a $3,000 suit that he can no longer afford. That man is Desmond, my father. He is screaming at a bank manager on the phone, begging for an extension that does not exist. He has no idea that the bank sold his toxic debt yesterday, and the buyer was me. But to understand why I am about to destroy the man who gave me life, you have to understand the night he tried to end mine. Before I walk into that boardroom and shatter his world, let's rewind 9 years. The storm that night was shaking the windows of our family estate in Atlanta. I was 19, shivering on the front porch, clutching a cheap duffel bag that held every piece of clothing I owned. My stomach was round with my unborn son Leo. The rain was soaking through my thin jacket, but the cold I felt inside was far worse. I wasn't asking for money. I wasn't asking for a handout. I just needed a roof over my head for one night because the women's shelter was full, and I had nowhere else to turn. The heavy oak door swung open, but instead of warmth, I was met with the cold, dead stare of my father. He didn't look at my trembling hands or my swollen belly with concern. He looked at me like I was a stain on his pristine driveway. I begged him. I said, "Dad, please, just for tonight. I have nowhere to go. I am scared." He laughed, a cruel, dry sound that cut sharper than the wind. He kicked my bag down the wet steps into a puddle and said the words that have burned in my soul for nearly a decade. He said, "Aaliyah, look at you. You are nothing but a liability. I am about to take this company public, and I cannot have a pregnant failure dragging down my stock price. You are an embarrassment to this family name. Take that mistake in your stomach and get out of my sight." He slammed the door in my face, leaving me in the dark. I stood there for a moment listening to the lock click shut, realizing that the only person I thought would protect me had just thrown me to the wolves. Before I continue this story of how I turned my tragedy into an empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build a castle from the bricks others threw at you. The shelter on 10th Street smelled of bleach and desperation. My first night there, I learned that hitting rock bottom was not a metaphor. It was a cold metal cot and a thin wool blanket that scratched my skin. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of a zipper sliding open. A woman from the bunk above was trying to steal my boots. I did not scream. I did not cry. I grabbed her wrist with a grip fueled by pure adrenaline and twisted it until she dropped them. That was the moment the scared teenager died and the survivor was born. I slept with my shoes tied to my chest from that night on, my arms wrapped around my belly as a shield. When my water broke, I was not in a private suite with family holding my hand. I was on a city bus, heading to an interview for a janitorial position. The driver panicked, and I ended up in the overcrowded ward of the county hospital. I gave birth to Leo alone, surrounded by the screams of strangers and the indifference of overworked nurses. When they placed him in my arms, he didn't cry. He looked up at me with wide, serious eyes, as if he knew the odds were already stacked against us. I looked at his tiny face and made a pact. We would not just survive, we would conquer. Recovery was a luxury I could not afford. 3 days later, I was back in the shelter, but I had a plan. The public library became my sanctuary, and my university. I strapped Leo to my chest in a sling I fashioned from a torn bedsheet and marched to the business section. While other mothers in the shelter watched daytime television or complained about the system, I was building a new one. I sat in the back corner of the library, nursing my son with one hand and turning the pages of textbooks on macroeconomics and venture capital with the other. The librarian Mrs. Higgins tried to kick me out once for bringing a baby until she saw I was graphing market trends on the back of napkin. She started leaving the Wall Street Journal on my table every morning. I did not have capital, but I had data. I started collecting discarded lottery tickets from the trash bins outside gas stations. I wasn't looking for a winning number. I was looking for patterns. I spent nights inputting the data into the library computer, teaching myself probability risk assessment and statistical variance. I analyzed why poor people stayed poor and how the system was designed to keep them that way. Those scratch-off tickets taught me more about human psychology and the fallacy of hope than any college course could have. I realized my father was right about one thing. In the world of business, you are either the player or the house. And I was done being the player. I was learning how to own the casino. The hunger in my stomach was nothing compared to the hunger in my mind. I was sharpening my teeth, preparing for the day I would take a bite out of the world that tried to starve me. My internship was not in a corner office with a view. It was in the janitor closet of Henderson Properties, one of the biggest commercial real estate firms in Atlanta. By day, I was the invisible woman pushing a mop bucket. By night, I was analyzing the documents these rich executives carelessly tossed into the recycling bins. They thought their secrets were safe because they assumed people like me could not read a balance sheet. That was their first mistake. One Tuesday night, while emptying the trash in the senior VP's office, I found a crumpled memo stained with coffee. Most people would have seen garbage. I saw a gold mine. The memo detailed a zoning approval for a massive warehouse project in the industrial district. The company attached to the project, vague and obscure on the stock market, was currently trading as a penny stock because everyone thought the deal was dead. The market believed the city had rejected the permits, but the paper in my hand, signed by the city commissioner that very afternoon, said otherwise. I had $1,200 to my name. It was money I had scraped together scrubbing toilets and skipping meals to save for a security deposit on an apartment. It was Leo's future. It was our lifeline. My hands shook as I logged onto the public library computer the next morning. I looked at the ticker symbol. It was trading at 18 cents a share. If I was wrong, I would be back to zero, sleeping in a shelter with a toddler. If I was right, I could buy my freedom. I looked down at Leo, who was sleeping in his stroller beside me, oblivious to the fact that his mother was about to gamble our entire existence on a piece of trash I found in a rich man's office. I didn't click buy with hope. I clicked it with rage. I bought 6,000 shares. For 48 hours, I did not sleep. I stared at the ceiling of the shelter, terrifying scenarios playing out in my head. Then the news broke on Thursday morning. The zoning approval was made public. The stock did not just jump, it skyrocketed. By the time the market closed on Friday, the stock was trading at $4.20. I stared at the screen, tears streaming down my face. I had turned $1,200 into over $25,000 in 3 days. It was more money than I had ever seen in my life. I withdrew the cash, walked into the bank, and opened a high-yield brokerage account. I did not buy a fancy car. I did not buy designer clothes. I bought a suit, a laptop, and a subscription to the Bloomberg terminal. That $1,200 was the seed. Now I was ready to grow a forest that would eventually swallow my father's company whole. The janitor was dead. The investor had arrived. 5 years later, the silence of my own home was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The cramped shelter bunk was a distant memory, replaced by a modest townhouse, where the only noise was the hum of my servers analyzing market trends. I was no longer gambling on penny stocks. I was acquiring distressed assets. I taught myself to spot the cracks in a company's foundation before the CEO even knew the building was shaking. I sat at my kitchen table, Leo coloring beside me, while I negotiated the hostile takeover of a mid-sized manufacturing plant in Ohio over the phone. I learned that men like my father respected only one language, and that was leverage. By year 7, the whispers began in the financial district. They did not know my face, but they knew my firm. They called me the Phoenix. It was fitting. I specialized in finding businesses that had been burned to the ground by incompetence and raising them back up for a massive profit. I stopped buying suits from department stores and started flying to Milan for fittings. My wardrobe became my armor, sharp, tailored, and intimidating. I walked into boardrooms with men double my age, men who looked at me and saw a young woman they could bully. By the time I walked out, I usually owned their majority shares. I didn't just survive the game, I changed the rules. Now 9 years have passed since the night I was thrown into the rain. I stand 40 floors above the city of Atlanta. The view from my corner office at Phoenix Holdings is breathtaking, a sprawling grid of lights and ambition. My desk is made of imported black marble, cold and solid, just like the reputation I have built. I am no longer the desperate teenager begging for a place to sleep. I am the chairwoman of a billion-dollar private equity firm. I control the fate of 3,000 employees across 6 states. My signature can save a legacy or liquidate it. My assistant knocks once before entering. He knows I detest interruptions. I turn from the window, my expression unreadable. I have trained myself to show no emotion, to be as impenetrable as the glass walls surrounding me. Leo is safe at a private academy protected by the empire I built with my own 2 hands. I have everything I ever dreamed of except the one thing money cannot buy, which is closure. But today that changes. Today I am not looking for a new investment. I am looking for a reckoning. The phone on my desk flashes. It is the private line only 3 people have access to. I press the speaker button, my hands steady, my heart rate unchanged. The game is about to enter the final round. The red light on my secure line blinked exactly at 2:00 p.m. I picked up the receiver before the second ring. There was only one person who had this number. Ethan was technically the general counsel for Desmond Logistics, my father's beloved company. But in reality, he was my most expensive and effective asset. I had paid off his law school loans 5 years ago, and in exchange, he gave me full visibility into the rotting core of my father's empire. "It is worse than we projected," Ethan whispered, his voice echoing slightly as if he was calling from a supply closet. "The auditors are scheduled to arrive next Monday. If they see the books, it is over. Desmond Logistics is not just bleeding cash, Aaliyah. It is clinically dead." I swiveled my chair toward the window, looking out at the skyline that I now owned a significant piece of. "Give me the numbers," I said coldly. "The operating account is overdrawn by $4 million, Ethan reported. "But that is not the headline. I tracked the leak. It is Jamal. Your brother has been siphoning corporate funds into offshore accounts in the Caymans. He is not even good at hiding it. He lists them as consulting fees for shell companies that do not exist. He has burned through $3 million in 18 months on high-stakes poker and luxury cars." "Does my father know?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Desmond never saw what he did not want to see. He is in denial," Ethan confirmed. "He thinks it is just a bad market cycle. He is currently screaming at his finance director, blaming the economy. He is desperate, Aaliyah. He is looking for a silent investor to inject $5 million of liquidity before the audit. He needs a miracle." I felt a surge of adrenaline that no stock trade could ever provide. My father did not need a miracle. He needed a lifeline, and he was too arrogant to realize that the line was attached to an anchor. This was the moment I had spent 9 years preparing for. The prey was wounded, bleeding out in the water, and thrashing for help. It was time for the shark to surface. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. I pressed the intercom button on my desk. Marcus, my executive assistant, answered immediately. "Cancel my meetings for the rest of the week," I ordered, my voice steady and devoid of warmth. "And call the flight crew. Tell them to prep the Gulf Stream. We are leaving in 2 hours. Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Where are we heading?" "Ma'am, New York." "London." I stood up and walked over to the closet in the corner of my office. Inside, hidden behind rows of Italian silk blazers, was the old, water-damaged duffel bag I had carried out of my father's house that rainy night. I ran my hand over the rough canvas. I wasn't going back as the pregnant teenager who begged for shelter. I was going back as the storm that would level the house. "We are going to Atlanta, Marcus," I said, a dangerous smile finally breaking through my stoic mask. "It is time for a family reunion. We are going home for Thanksgiving." The gravel of the driveway crunched beneath the tires of the beige sedan I had rented at the airport. It was a deliberate choice. I could have pulled up in a convoy of black SUVs, but the element of surprise required me to play the role they expected. I needed to be the struggling single mother, the failure, the liability. Beside me, Leo looked out the window at the sprawling estate with a critical eye. At 9 years old, he had seen more of the world than my father ever would. He adjusted his collar and looked at me. He asked if this was the place where I grew up. I told him that this was just a house, not a home. I parked the car next to Jamal's brand new Porsche, the one he bought with stolen company funds. The contrast was almost comical. As I killed the engine, I saw them. Desmond and Jamal were standing on the porch holding tumblers of scotch, looking down at us like royalty, surveying peasants. My father had aged, but the arrogance in his posture was timeless. He didn't smile, he didn't wave. He just watched as I opened the door and stepped out into the humid Atlanta air. I walked around to open the door for Leo. I could feel their eyes boring into my back, judging my clothes, my hair, my car. I was wearing a simple dress from a department store rack, another costume for the performance. As we approached the steps, the very steps where he had thrown my suitcase 9 years ago, Desmond didn't move to hug me. He took a sip of his drink and shook his head. "Look what the wind blew in." Desmond said, his voice loud enough to carry across the lawn. "I hope you kept the receipt for that car, Aaliyah. It looks like it is about to break down right here in my driveway." Jamal laughed, a hollow, sycophantic sound. He leaned against the railing, twirling his car keys. He asked if I was lost, or if I just ran out of money again. He said that the soup kitchen was downtown, not in the suburbs. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs, holding Leo's hand. I looked up at the men who shared my blood, but not my spirit. I kept my face neutral, masking the disgust I felt. I told them I just wanted to introduce them to their grandson and have a meal with family. Desmond scoffed. He pointed a finger at me, the gold ring on his hand glinting in the sun. He told me that if I was here to ask for a loan, I should turn around and leave right now. He said he wasn't running a charity for mistakes. I squeezed Leo's hand gently when I felt him tense up. I looked my father dead in the eye and lied with the ease of a seasoned negotiator. I said I didn't need his money. I said I just wanted to come home. Desmond rolled his eyes and turned back to the house, muttering that I better not embarrass him in front of the guests. Jamal smirked and followed him inside, leaving the door open just enough for us to squeeze through. They had no idea they had just invited the executioner to dinner. The air inside the foyer was frigid, a stark contrast to the humidity outside, but the real chill came from the woman descending the grand staircase. Courtney, my brother's wife, looked like she had been manufactured in a factory that specialized in country club elitism. Her blonde hair was sprayed into a helmet of perfection, and she wore a silk blouse that cost more than the car I had rented. She stopped on the bottom step, swirling a glass of Chardonnay, her blue eyes scanning me with a mixture of amusement and disdain. She didn't offer a hug. She didn't even offer a handshake. She just took a sip of her wine and smiled a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Aaliyah," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We were placing bets on whether you would actually show up. I told Jamal we should set an extra folding chair at the kids' table just in case." She walked over to us, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. She ignored me and focused her attention on Leo. My son stood tall, his hands clasped behind his back, observing her with the quiet intelligence that always unsettled people who expected him to be rowdy. Courtney reached out and fingered the fabric of Leo's plain navy t-shirt as if she were inspecting a dirty rag. "Oh, this is..." Quaint, she said, wrinkling her nose slightly. It is so durable. I suppose when you are raising a child in those kinds of neighborhoods, you have to prioritize function over fashion. My little Julian is wearing custom Ralph Lauren today. We just feel that dressing for success starts in the cradle. But I guess not everyone has the means or the taste to appreciate the finer details. Leo didn't flinch. He looked at her hand on his shoulder and then up at her face, his expression unbothered. I felt a surge of pride. He had more class in his little finger than she had in her entire body. But Courtney wasn't finished. She needed to draw blood. She straightened up and looked at me, tilting her head to the side as if studying a scientific specimen. He is a handsome boy, though, she said, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. He has that wild look in his eyes. I guess those genetics are just impossible to breed out, aren't they? It must be so hard for you, Aaliyah, trying to raise him to be civilized when his nature is working against you. I mean, we all know what happens to boys like him if they aren't kept on a tight leash. The room went silent. The insult was wrapped in concern, but it was a dagger nonetheless. She was calling my son a thug before he had even hit puberty. My blood boiled hot and fast, urging me to slap the wineglass out of her hand. I wanted to tell her that my son spoke fluent French and was learning Python coding while her son was likely struggling to tie his own shoelaces. But I remembered the mission. I needed them to think I was the beaten dog. I pulled Leo closer to my side and forced a tight, submissive smile. "We do our best, Courtney," I said softly. She laughed a tinkling, dismissive sound and patted my cheek. "Of course you do, sweetie. Now run along to the kitchen. I think the help might need a hand, and you look like you know your way around a mop better than a wine list." She turned her back on us and walked away, confident in her superiority. She had no idea that she had just moved to the very top of my liquidation list. I wasn't just going to take their company, I was going to take her pride. Courtney decided that the best way to cleanse the palate after insulting my son was to flaunt her liquor cabinet. She walked over to the mahogany bar cart, her hips swaying with practiced arrogance, and picked up a bottle of red wine as if it were a holy relic. She held it up to the light, ensuring the label was facing me, assuming I wouldn't know a Cabernet from a cola. "We only serve the finest here," she announced loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "This is a 2018 Chateau de Fantaisie. It is an extremely rare vintage from the Bordeaux region. Jamal had to call in a special favor just to get 3 bottles. I wouldn't expect you to appreciate the complexity, Aaliyah, considering your palate is probably used to boxed wine, but I suppose we can waste a glass on you for the sake of the holiday." She began to uncork the bottle with a flourish, waiting for me to look impressed. I stayed silent, but Leo, who had been standing quietly by my side, took a step forward. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly behind his glasses as he studied the label on the bottle in Courtney's hand. "Excuse me, Aunt Courtney," Leo said, his voice polite and steady. Courtney paused, looking down at him with a mixture of annoyance and amusement. "What is it, sweetie? Do you want a juice box? We might have some in the back of the pantry." "No, thank you," Leo replied. "I was just confused. You said that is a 2018 Bordeaux from a dry harvest." Courtney rolled her eyes. "Yes, that is what I said. It is very expensive." Leo frowned slightly and switched effortlessly into flawless French. "Mais ce n'est pas possible. La région de Bordeaux a eu des pluies torrentielles en 2018. The room went dead silent. Courtney froze the corkscrew halfway into the bottle. Jamal stopped mid-sip of his scotch. My father looked at Leo as if the boy had just grown a second head. "Excuse me," Courtney stammered, her face flushing a deep, ugly red. "What did you just say to me?" Leo switched back to English without missing a beat, his tone helpful and innocent. "I said that is impossible. I read in The Economist that the Bordeaux region suffered torrential rains in 2018, which ruined the harvest for Grand Cru vineyards. Also, the label on that bottle says vin de table. That means table wine. It is a blend of grapes from different regions, not a single vintage. My mom buys a similar one for cooking stew. It costs about $12. I took a sip of my water to hide the smirk threatening to break across my face. Courtney looked at the bottle, then at Leo, then at Jamal. She looked like she wanted to throw the glass against the wall. Well, she sputtered, clearly flustered. You don't know what you are talking about. You are just a child. Actually, Leo continued, relentless in his factual assault. The Appellation d'origine contrôlée seal is missing from the neck. If it were a real vintage, it would have the stamp. Jamal stepped in, snatching the bottle from Courtney's hand and shoving it back onto the cart. Okay, that is enough. The kid watches too much TV. Let's just sit down and eat. Courtney smoothed her dress, her hands trembling with rage. She shot a look of pure venom at Leo, but my son just looked up at me and winked. She wanted to shame us for being poor, but she had just been exposed as a fraud by a 9-year-old. The dinner hadn't even started, and I was already winning. Dinner was served with a side of delusion. We sat around the long mahogany table, the silence broken only by the scrape of silver forks against fine china. The roast beef was rare, bleeding onto the plates, a fitting metaphor for a company that was currently hemorrhaging cash. But you wouldn't know it by listening to my father. Desmond sat at the head of the table, his face flushed with alcohol and pride beaming at his son, as if Jamal had just cured a disease rather than embezzled a fortune. To the future of Desmond Logistics, my father bellowed, raising his glass of expensive red wine. He looked at Jamal with eyes full of adoration. Son, tell everyone about the new contract with the distribution center in Savannah. I was telling the board just yesterday that you are the only one with the vision to expand our fleet in this economy. While everyone else is shrinking, my boy is growing the empire. Jamal wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, leaning back in his chair, with the casual arrogance of a man who believes his own lies. He swirled his wine, avoiding my gaze. Oh, the Savannah deal, he said, waving his hand dismissively. It is pretty much a done deal, Dad. We are looking at a $3 million net profit in the first quarter alone. I had to play hardball with their CEO, but you know me. I don't leave money on the table. Once we sign on Tuesday, we are going to be untouchable. I slowly cut a piece of potato, keeping my eyes fixed on my plate. I knew for a fact that the Savannah deal had fallen through 3 weeks ago because Jamal had forgotten to file the insurance compliance paperwork. The only thing Jamal had signed on Tuesday was a marker for $50,000 at a private poker game in Buckhead. But I didn't say a word. I just chewed my food, letting the silence stretch out. Desmond slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. He pointed a shaking finger at me. Look at her, he sneered, his voice dripping with disgust. Head down, mouth shut, just eating my food and taking up space. You see the difference, Aaliyah. Your brother is out there hunting, bringing home the kill, securing the legacy of this family. And you are just grazing. He turned to Courtney, seeking validation. It is a tragedy, really. Jamal got all the business DNA. He has the fire. Aaliyah has nothing. She is content to live in mediocrity. I bet she doesn't even understand what a $3 million contract looks like. She probably thinks $100 is a lot of money. I took a sip of water to wash down the dryness of his insult. He thought my silence was submission. He thought I was cowed by his volume and Jamal's fantasy numbers. He didn't realize that in the wild, the predator that makes the most noise is usually the one that gets eaten. The lion doesn't roar when it is stalking. It stays quiet until it is time to strike. And I was very, very quiet. Desmond wiped his mouth with his napkin, the motion aggressive and final. He was not finished. The humiliation his wife had just suffered at the hands of my son needed to be rectified, and in his mind, the only way to lift one family member up was to push another one down. He turned his heavy gaze toward me, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized my plain dress and lack of jewelry. So, Aaliyah, he started, his voice booming across the table. We have all heard about Jamal's triumphs. We know he is securing the legacy of this family. But what exactly have you been doing for the last 9 years, besides teaching your son to be disrespectful to his betters? I carefully cut a piece of the overcooked roast beef. I work in finance. Dad, I said simply. Mostly in risk management and asset acquisition. Desmond let out a sharp barking laugh. Jamal joined in, snickering into his scotch. Finance, Desmond mocked. You mean you work as a teller at a bank? Or do you mean you sell cheap jewelry on the internet and call it a small business? Don't try to use big words to impress me, girl. I know exactly what you are. You are the same person who showed up on my porch with nothing but a suitcase and a mistake in her belly. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, invading my personal space. Let me be crystal clear with you, Aaliyah. I brought you here today out of pity. But do not think for 1 second that you are getting a cut of the pie. This company, this house, every single cent I have, built it all goes to Jamal. He is the heir. You are getting nothing, not a dime. So if you came here sniffing around for an inheritance, you are wasting your time. I stopped eating. I placed my fork down on the porcelain plate with a deliberate soft click. The sound was quiet, but it seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the room. I looked up, meeting my father's gaze with a calmness that unnerved him. He expected tears. He expected begging. He did not expect ice. I did not come here for your money, Dad. I said, my voice steady and low. I have plenty of my own. In fact, based on the current market volatility and the outdated business model of Desmond Logistics, I think you should be less concerned about my inheritance and more concerned about whether you will have anything left to leave anyone. Desmond turned a shade of purple I had never seen before. Jamal stopped laughing instantly. Are you lecturing me? Desmond hissed. You think because you balance a checkbook, you know how to run a multi-million-dollar corporation? I didn't say that, I replied, picking up my wine glass. I am just saying that the market is a dangerous place for companies that are over-leveraged and undermanaged. You never know when a bigger fish might decide that you look like a good meal. You should focus on keeping what you have, Dad. Because in my experience, fortunes can disappear overnight. Desmond slammed his fist on the table, making the candles flicker. You ungrateful little brat. I took a sip of water, unbothered. I am not ungrateful, I said. I am just realistic. Now please pass the salt. The roast is a little dry. The apple pie was served, but the real dessert was the humiliation my family had planned for the gift exchange. We moved to the living room, where the fireplace crackled with a warmth that did not extend to the people sitting around it. Jamal made a show of presenting his gift to our father first. It was a box of Cuban cigars that I knew cost more than the monthly salary of his average warehouse worker. Desmond accepted them with a grunt of approval, lighting one immediately and filling the room with thick, acrid smoke. He leaned back in his leather armchair, looking like a king on his throne, waiting for his tribute. I reached into my bag and pulled out a rectangular package wrapped in simple brown paper. I walked over and placed it on the side table next to his Scotch glass. It is not much, Dad, I said quietly, but I thought it might be useful given the current economic climate. Desmond looked at the package with suspicion, as if it might explode. He tore off the paper, revealing a thick hardcover book titled Advanced Risk Management and Strategies for Corporate Insolvency. The room went silent again. Desmond stared at the cover, his face darkening with a mixture of confusion and rage. He looked up at me, the cigar trembling slightly between his fingers. Is this a joke? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. You come into my house, eat my food, and then you insult me with a self-help book for failed businessmen. Do you think I need a manual on how to run the empire I built while you were still in diapers? Before I could answer, Jamal sprang from the sofa. He snatched the book from the table, holding it up like a piece of evidence in a murder trial. This is exactly what I'm talking about, Dad. She doesn't respect you. She thinks because she read a few blogs, she can come in here and lecture us. Jamal walked over to the ornate trash can in the corner of the room. He held the book over it, locking eyes with me, daring me to stop him. Dad is a king in this city, Aaliyah. He doesn't need advice from a charity case. He let the book drop. It landed with a heavy thud among the discarded wrapping paper and cigar clippings. I watched the book fall, and for a split second I almost felt sorry for them. They had no idea what they had just thrown away. Tucked securely inside the front cover was a cashier's check for $50,000. It was not a bribe, it was a test. It was a lifeline meant to cover the payroll they were struggling to meet next week. I had written it out that morning, a final attempt to see if there was any humility left in this house. If they had just opened the book, if they had just shown 1 ounce of grace, they would have found it. But they didn't. Jamal dusted his hands off as if he had just taken out the trash, looking proud of himself. Desmond took a long drag of his cigar, nodding at his son. "Good," Desmond said. "We don't need clutter in this house." I smiled, a genuine, chilling smile. "You are absolutely right, Dad," I said. "You certainly don't need that book." I sat back down, mentally canceling the check in my head. The test was over. They had failed. And now I was going to collect the debt. The dinner had been a masterclass in indigestion, served with a side of emotional abuse. After the cigar incident, I excused myself from the table, claiming I needed a glass of water for Leo. In reality, I needed to step away before I laughed in their faces. My father and brother were celebrating a victory that did not exist, burning bridges they were standing on. I walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, the heavy velvet runners muffling my footsteps. As I approached the swinging service doors, I heard voices raised in a hushed but venomous whisper. I stopped, pressing my back against the wall next to the pantry. It was Jamal and Courtney, and the mask of the happy power couple had completely fallen off. "You promised me that bag," Jamal. Courtney hissed, the sound sharp enough to cut glass. "You told me the bonus from the Savannah deal was already in the account. I put a deposit down at the boutique. If I call them tomorrow and my card is declined, I will never show my face at the club again. Keep your voice down." Jamal snapped back, his tone laced with panic. "The Savannah deal is dead. Okay. It died 3 weeks ago." Courtney let out a cruel, mocking laugh. "Dead? So you lied to your father at the dinner table, you lied to the board, and you lied to me. So where is the money, Jamal? Where is the operating capital you said you secured?" I heard the sound of a fist hitting the granite countertop. "I tried to fix it," Jamal whispered, his voice trembling. "I took the payroll funds for this month. Just 80,000. I took it to the private game in Buckhead. I had a feeling, Courtney. I was up 10 grand in the first hour. I thought I could double the payroll and put the principal back before anyone noticed." There was a long, cold silence. When Courtney spoke again, her voice was devoid of any empathy. "You gambled the employee payroll. You lost the money for the warehouse workers so you could play poker." "I got a bad hand," Jamal pleaded. "It was just bad luck." "I don't care about your luck," Courtney spat. "And I certainly don't care about those warehouse workers. I care about my lifestyle. Listen to me very carefully, Jamal. If I do not have that Hermes Birkin on my arm by the charity gala next week, I am not just leaving you. I am taking the kids and I am going to my mother's house in Savannah, and I will tell everyone exactly why I left. You have 48 hours to find the money. Steal it from your dad, borrow it from a loan shark. I don't care. Just fix it." I heard the click of her heels as she stormed out of the kitchen through the side door leading to the garden. I stood in the hallway, my heart pounding, a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. I had suspected incompetence. I had suspected fraud. But this was better. This was criminal negligence. Jamal had just confessed to embezzlement and gambling with company funds. He wasn't just a bad businessman. He was a felon in the making. And Courtney, the woman who looked down on me for being poor, was nothing more than a co-conspirator who valued a handbag over human livelihood. I didn't just have a plan anymore. I had a smoking gun, and I knew exactly when to pull the trigger. I stepped away from the kitchen door, my heart hammering against my ribs, not from fear, but from the thrill of absolute certainty. The confession I had just overheard was the final nail in the coffin of Desmond Logistics. Jamal had not just been incompetent, he had been criminally negligent, and Courtney was his willing accomplice. I walked back into the living room, my face a mask of polite indifference. Desmond was still in his armchair pontificating to a bored-looking guest about his golf handicap. Jamal was nowhere to be seen, likely outside frantically trying to secure a loan shark on a burner phone. I walked over to where Leo was sitting quietly in the corner reading a magazine he had brought from the car. I touched his shoulder gently. "It is time to go, Leo," I said softly. He looked up, relief washing over his young face. He closed the magazine and stood up immediately, ready to leave this house of toxicity. I turned to my father. "Thank you for dinner, Dad," I said, my voice steady. It was certainly educational. Desmond didn't even look up from his cigar. "Just make sure you lock the gate on your way out," he grunted. "I don't want the neighbors thinking I am running a halfway house." I didn't respond. I simply took Leo's hand and walked toward the foyer. Standing by the heavy oak door was Ethan, the family lawyer. He was checking his watch, looking weary. To the rest of the family, Ethan was just the hired help, the man who filed the paperwork and kept the secrets. To me, he was the most valuable asset in the room. He saw me approaching and stepped forward to open the door, his face professional and blank. "I hope you have a safe drive back to the city, Aaliyah," Ethan said loudly enough for my father to hear in the other room. I paused on the threshold, the cool night air hitting my face. I turned to Ethan, shielding my mouth slightly from the security camera in the corner of the hallway. "They are expecting the credit line from City National to clear by 9 a.m. tomorrow, aren't they?" I asked in a whisper. Ethan nodded imperceptibly. "It is the only liquidity they have left. If that money doesn't hit the operating account, the payroll checks bounce on Friday." I looked past him at the portrait of my father hanging above the mantel, a painting of a man who believed he was untouchable. "Make the call, Ethan," I said, my voice cold and final. "Call your contact at Risk Management. Send over the anonymous tip about the missing pension funds. Trigger the compliance clause." Ethan's eyes widened slightly behind his glasses. "That will cause an immediate freeze on all lending. It will paralyze the company within hours. It is the nuclear option, Aaliyah." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Exactly. Activate Phase 2. Cut the cord. I want them suffocating by breakfast." Ethan gave a single sharp nod. "Consider it done." I walked down the steps to my rental car, the gravel crunching beneath my boots sounding like the ticking of a clock. I buckled Leo in and started the engine. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror at the sprawling mansion glowing in the darkness. My father was inside drinking his expensive scotch, thinking he was the king of the world. He had no idea that I had just turned off the lights. The siege had begun. The sun rose over Atlanta the next morning, but for Desmond Logistics, it was the beginning of the end. I was sitting in my hotel suite, sipping green tea, monitoring the company's internal servers remotely. At exactly 9 a.m., the first domino fell. My father was in his office, nursing a hangover from the scotch he had consumed to celebrate his imaginary success. He reached for the phone to call his banker at City National, expecting the routine confirmation of his credit line extension. Instead, he was met with a wall of ice. I listened to the recording of the call later. The bank manager, a man my father had played golf with for 20 years, was professional but lethal. He informed Desmond that due to a flagged compliance issue regarding the pension fund and an anonymous tip about solvency, the Risk Assessment Committee had frozen all credit facilities effective immediately. There would be no extension. There would be no liquidity. The line went dead before my father could even scream. 5 minutes later, the second domino fell. The foreman from the main distribution hub called. The payroll transfer that was supposed to hit the employees' accounts at midnight had failed. The warehouse workers, men who lived paycheck to paycheck and whom my father treated like disposable parts, had walked off the job. 48 trucks were sitting idle at the loading docks, their engines cold while perishable cargo rotted in the heat. The drivers were picketing at the front gate, chanting slogans that could be heard all the way up in the executive suite. Desmond was hyperventilating. He paced his office like a caged animal, his face a mask of sweat and terror. He was bleeding $50,000 an hour in penalties for delayed shipments. He needed cash, and he needed it 5 minutes ago. That was when Jamal walked in. My brother looked even worse than my father. He knew that the audit was coming, and he knew that without a massive injection of capital, his embezzlement would be exposed within days. He wasn't trying to save the company, he was trying to save himself from prison. "Dad, listen to me," Jamal said, his voice shaking. "The banks are useless. They are scared. But I have a contact. I met a broker in Buckhead last month who represents a private equity firm. They are called Phoenix Holdings." Desmond stopped pacing. "Who are they?" "I have never heard of them." "They are new," Jamal lied, desperate to sell the con. "They are aggressive. They specialize in high-risk bridge loans. They don't care about compliance checks or pension audits. They just care about collateral. They can wire $5 million by this afternoon, Dad. But we have to move fast." Desmond looked out the window at the striking workers and the motionless trucks. He looked at the portrait of himself on the wall, the image of a titan that was dissolving before his eyes. He didn't ask about the interest rate. He didn't ask about the terms. He just nodded, his eyes hollow. "Call them," Desmond whispered. "Get them on the phone. I don't care what it costs. Just get me the money." I smiled as I watched the status light on my private line turn green. Jamal was dialing the number. He thought he was calling a savior. He had no idea he was calling the executioner. The lobby of Phoenix Holdings was designed to intimidate. It was a cavern of black marble and chrome, chilled to a temperature that kept visitors alert and uncomfortable. When Desmond and Jamal walked in at 1 p.m., they looked small. The swagger they displayed at the dinner table yesterday had evaporated, replaced by the twitchy energy of men who owed money they did not have. I sat in my private observation room watching them on a wall of high-definition monitors. The audio feed was crystal clear. I could hear the tap of my father's expensive loafers on the floor and the nervous, shallow breathing of my brother. I had given specific instructions to the front desk. They were to be treated with polite indifference. When they approached the receptionist, a young woman named Sarah, whom I had personally trained for this moment, she didn't even look up from her screen for a full minute. Desmond cleared his throat loudly, expecting the world to jump. Sarah finally raised her eyes and told them that the partners were in a meeting and they would have to wait. I let them wait for 3 hours. It was a deliberate calculation. I wanted to see how long it would take for my father's facade to crack. For the first hour, he paced the waiting area, checking his gold Rolex every 30 seconds, muttering about disrespect. He pulled out his phone and yelled at his secretary, blaming her for the strike that was currently consuming his company. He was a man who only knew how to punch down, and now that he was in a room where he had no power, he was unraveling. By the second hour, the silence of the room was eating him alive. He sat down, loosening his tie. I zoomed in on his face. The veins in his neck were bulging. He looked old. For my entire life, Desmond had been a giant, a terrifying figure of authority. But on that screen, stripped of his leverage, he was just a desperate, angry old man in a suit that was starting to wrinkle. Jamal was worse. He sat with his head in his hands, his leg bouncing uncontrollably. He knew that every minute they wasted here was a minute closer to the auditors finding his offshore accounts. He tried to make small talk with Desmond, assuring him that this was just standard procedure for high-level financiers. Desmond told him to shut up. Finally, at the 3-hour mark, I pressed the button on my intercom. "Send in Mr. Sterling," I commanded. Mr. Sterling was my proxy. He was a tall, imposing man with a British accent and a face made of stone. He walked into the waiting room, not apologizing for the delay. He simply gestured for them to follow him into the conference room. He did not take them to the executive suite. He took them to one of the smaller, windowless meeting rooms we used for low-level negotiations. I watched as my father and brother scrambled to follow him, their desperation making them clumsy. They thought they were finally getting a seat at the table. They did not realize they were walking into a cage. Mr. Sterling did not offer them coffee. He did not offer them small talk. He simply opened a leather folder and slid a 50-page document across the polished mahogany table. I adjusted the camera zoom from my observation room, focusing on the bead of sweat rolling down my father's temple. He picked up the contract, his hands shaking slightly, and began to read. I saw his eyes widen as he reached page 5. This was not a standard loan agreement. It was a death warrant for his ownership. Clause 4. B. Desmond read aloud, his voice trembling with disbelief. In the event of a default or a missed payment within the first 30 days, Phoenix Holdings reserves the right to seize all collateral immediately without a court order. He looked up at Sterling, his face pale. And the collateral listed here, it includes the commercial fleet, the warehouse inventory, and my private residence. You want my house? We require full asset securitization for high-risk clients. Sterling replied, his voice devoid of emotion. Your credit rating is currently non-existent, Mr. Desmond. You are asking for $5 million in cash while your employees are picketing outside your gates. To us, you are not a businessman. You are a gamble. If you are confident in your ability to repay, then putting up the house should not be a problem. Desmond slammed the folder shut. This is insanity. This house has been in my family for 3 generations. My mother left it to me. I cannot gamble the roof over my head. Come on, Jamal. We are leaving. Desmond stood up, grabbing his jacket. For a second I thought he actually had a spine. But Jamal remained seated. My brother was not looking at the contract. He was looking at the clock on the wall. He knew that in less than 24 hours the auditors would open the books. He knew that if this money did not hit the account today, he would be trading his designer suit for a prison uniform. Sit down, Dad. Jamal said, his voice sharp and desperate. Desmond froze. What did you say to me? I said sit down. Jamal repeated, standing up to face him. We don't have a choice. Look at your phone. The union rep just texted. They are talking about going to the press. If this story hits the news tonight, the stock will tank to zero. You won't just lose the house, you will lose the legacy. You will be the man who destroyed Desmond Logistics. Desmond looked at his son, conflict raging in his eyes. He was terrified of losing his status, but he was terrified of the contract. Jamal moved in for the kill, placing a hand on his father's shoulder, using the very trust he had betrayed to manipulate him one last time. It is just a bridge loan, Dad. Jamal lied smoothly. We get the cash. We pay the drivers. The trucks start moving. The Savannah deal signs on Tuesday, and we pay these guys back in full with interest. We will be out of this contract in a week. Trust me, I have everything under control. I watched my father crumble. The fear of public humiliation outweighed his business instinct. He slowly sat back down. He picked up the heavy fountain pen Sterling offered him. He didn't read the rest of the terms. He didn't see the clause about the immediate audit rights. He just signed his name on the dotted line. The scratching of the pen on the paper was the sound of a guillotine blade dropping. Jamal let out a breath he had been holding for days. He smiled, thinking he had just saved his own skin. He didn't realize he had just sold his soul to the sister he despised. The wire transfer from Phoenix Holdings hit the Desmond Logistics operating account at exactly 9:03 a.m. It was the first tranche of the $5 million loan, a lifeline of $2.5 million meant to stop the bleeding. In his office, my father slumped into his leather chair, the color finally returning to his gray face. He picked up the intercom and barked at his secretary to tell the payroll department to cut the checks. He believed he had survived the storm. He believed he was back in control. He had no idea that the man standing right outside his door was about to slit the throat of the company he had just mortgaged his soul to save. Jamal did not share his father's relief. He felt only the crushing weight of Courtney's ultimatum. He retreated to his office and locked the door. His hands were shaking as he logged into the corporate banking portal. He could hear the faint chants of the striking truck drivers outside his window, men who had not been paid in weeks, men who couldn't buy groceries for their families. Jamal ignored them. He wasn't thinking about the drivers. He was thinking about the empty spot on Courtney's arm and the threat she had made to leave him. He navigated to the fund distribution screen. The payroll batch was queued up, waiting for authorization. All he had to do was click approve, and 300 families would be able to pay their rent. Instead, Jamal opened a new transfer window. He typed in the routing number for a shell company called C-Lux Consulting, an entity that existed solely to pay off Courtney's black card bills. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his finger hovering over the enter key. Then he typed in the amount. $50,000. He hit send. The confirmation screen flashed green. Transaction complete. Jamal let out a breath, convincing himself that he would put it back before the auditors arrived next week. He told himself it was just a temporary loan. In my command center across town, the reaction was instantaneous. A crimson alert bar slashed across my monitor, accompanied by a sharp digital chime. My algorithm designed to flag any transaction over $10,000 that did not match vendor history had caught him in real time. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the metadata. I traced the routing number in seconds. It didn't go to a fuel supplier. It didn't go to an insurance broker. It went to a private account at a bank in Buckhead, known for high net worth personal banking. I sat back in my chair, a cold smile playing on my lips. I looked at the timestamp. The money had been in their account for less than 12 minutes, and Jamal had already stolen it. He had prioritized a handbag over the survival of the company. I picked up the phone to call Ethan. I told him to log the transaction time and the IP address. I told him not to stop it. I wanted the transaction to clear. I wanted the paper trail to be indelible. Jamal thought he was buying his wife's affection. In reality, he had just purchased a one-way ticket to a federal indictment. The trap wasn't just set. It had snapped shut, and the rat was still eating the cheese, unaware that his neck was already broken. Ethan walked into my temporary command center at the hotel suite just after midnight. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, and his eyes red from staring at spreadsheets, but he carried a thick manila envelope like it was a weapon. He didn't say a word. He just dropped the file onto the glass coffee table in front of me. The sound it made was heavy, the thud of indisputable guilt. I picked up the folder and opened it. The first thing I saw was a series of high-resolution photographs taken from a security feed at the Diamond Club, the most exclusive high-stakes casino in the city. There was Jamal sitting at a blackjack table, a crystal glass of whiskey in one hand and a stack of chips in the other. He was laughing, his head thrown back, in a display of carefree arrogance that made my stomach turn. The timestamp on the photos was from 2 hours ago. While his father was sweating over union negotiations and his drivers were standing in unemployment lines, my brother was gambling away the lifeline I had just extended to them. Ethan tapped the paper next to the photos. It was a transaction log from the corporate account. After the $50,000 transfer to Courtney, Jamal had made 3 cash withdrawals of $10,000 each at an ATM near the casino. "He is not even trying to hide it," Ethan said, his voice thick with disgust. "He is treating the corporate operating account like his personal piggy bank. Aaliyah, this is grand larceny. We have enough right here to have him arrested tonight. The police would pick him up at the blackjack table. We can end this now." I studied the photo of Jamal's smiling face. I traced the line of his jaw with my finger. It would be so easy to call the police. It would be satisfying to see him dragged out of the casino in handcuffs in front of his wealthy friends. But that was too quick. That was a mercy he did not deserve. Arresting him now would make him a victim of his own addiction. I didn't want him to be a victim. I wanted him to be the villain in his own tragedy. "No," I said, closing the folder slowly. "Not yet." Ethan looked at me confused. "What are you waiting for?" "He is bleeding the company dry. Every dollar he spends is a dollar less for the assets you are about to seize." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "I don't care about $30,000, Ethan. I care about the total destruction of his credibility. If we arrest him now, my father will spin it. He will say Jamal has a problem, that he needs help, that it was a mistake. He will try to garner sympathy. I need Jamal to dig the hole so deep that even Desmond cannot climb out of it to save him." I turned back to Ethan, my expression cold and hard. "Let him play. Let him win a few hands. Let him order the expensive champagne and tip the waitress with money that belongs to starving families. We are not just catching a thief, Ethan. We are preparing a sacrifice. You know what farmers do before the harvest. They feed the livestock. So let him eat. Let him get fat and happy and confident. Because when I finally slaughter him, I want there to be plenty of meat on the bone. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of the executive suite, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. But it did nothing to brighten Desmond's mood. He was staring at the digital ledger on his computer screen, his brow furrowed in confusion that was quickly boiling into rage. The math did not add up. The wire from Phoenix Holdings had cleared, but the available balance was short. $50,000 short. To a company the size of Desmond Logistics, 50,000 used to be a rounding error. But today it was the difference between solvency and disaster. Desmond did not call Jamal. He did not question the prodigal son who had access to the codes. Instead, he slammed his fist on the intercom button and summoned Arthur Henderson. Mr. Henderson was 68 years old, a man with a spine curved from 40 years of hunching over ledgers in service of my father's empire. He walked into the office clutching a file, his hands trembling slightly, sensing the predator's mood. "Where is it?" Arthur Desmond demanded, not even offering him a seat. "Where is the $50,000 that left this account 20 minutes ago?" Arthur blinked behind his thick glasses. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir. I authorized the payroll batch as you instructed. I haven't moved any other funds." "Don't lie to me," Desmond roared, standing up and towering over the smaller man. "The transaction log shows a transfer to an external consultant. I didn't authorize that. You are the only other person with the admin key. Did you think you could skim a little off the top before the ship sinks? Is that it? You are stealing my money to pad your retirement." Arthur's face turned an ashen shade of gray. "Sir, I have served this company since your father was in charge. I would never steal. Please check the user ID on the transfer. It might have been a system error, or perhaps Jamal. Do not say his name." Desmond cut him off, his voice shaking with a mix of fury and denial. He knew. Deep down, he knew exactly who had taken the money. But admitting that his son was a thief meant admitting that his entire succession plan was a lie. It was easier to destroy a loyal servant than to face the truth. "You are incompetent, Arthur. You are a thief and a liar. Get out of my office. You are fired." Arthur gasped, his hand flying to his chest. He stumbled back, dropping the file. Papers scattered across the floor like white feathers. His breathing became ragged, a wheezing sound that filled the sudden silence of the room. He collapsed onto one knee, clutching his heart. "Sir, please," he wheezed. "My pills! In my pocket!" Desmond didn't move to help him. He didn't call 911. He looked at the man suffering on his Persian rug with sheer annoyance. "Get up," Desmond spat. "Stop acting. I said get out. Security, get this old fool out of my building before I press charges for embezzlement." I watched the feed from my hotel room, my knuckles white as I gripped the edge of the table. I had expected my father to be ruthless. I had expected him to be greedy, but I had not expected him to be evil. He was watching a man die to protect his own ego. Arthur was dragged out by two security guards, still gasping for air. Desmond straightened his tie, sat back down, and deleted the transaction log that incriminated his son. He thought he had buried the problem. He didn't know that he had just handed me the witness who would bury him. I stood at the foot of the hospital bed in the cardiac wing of St. Joseph's, watching the monitor trace the rhythm of a broken heart. Arthur Henderson looked smaller without his suit, a frail man who had given 40 years of his life to a monster who discarded him like a used napkin. When his eyes fluttered open, panic was the first emotion to register. He tried to sit up, his hand grasping for the call button, his breathing quickening as the reality of his situation crashed down on him. He was unemployed, uninsured, and lying in a private suite that cost more per night than he made in a month. I stepped forward, placing a calming hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Henderson, please lie down," I said softly. "Your heart rate is spiking. You need to rest." He blinked his eyes, focusing on my face. Aaliyah. He rasped, his voice weak. What are you doing here? You shouldn't be here. Your father. If he finds out. My father is not in charge here, I interrupted, pouring him a glass of water. And neither is the billing department. I took care of your admission fees, Arthur. I paid for the surgery and I prepaid for your recovery therapy. You don't owe the hospital a dime. He stared at me, confusion warring with gratitude. I don't understand. Why I couldn't stop him. I tried to tell him about the money. I know you did, I said. I saw everything on the security feed. You were the only person in that building who tried to do the right thing. Loyalty is a currency. Arthur, and you spent yours on a man who is bankrupt of morality. I am here to offer you a new investment. I reached into my bag and pulled out a contract. It was an employment agreement for a senior financial consultant position at Phoenix Holdings. The salary was triple what my father had been paying him. I want to hire you, Arthur. Not to cook books, but to audit them. I am the one buying Desmond Logistics, and I need someone who knows where the bodies are buried. Arthur looked at the contract, his hands trembling. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time he saw the resemblance, not to my father, but to the shark that was about to eat him. He saw the power I held. Tears welled up in his eyes, not of sadness, but of vindication. He slowly pushed himself up the monitor, steadying as his resolve hardened. You want to know where the bodies are buried? He whispered, a grim smile touching his lips. Aaliyah. I didn't just bury them, I kept a map. He reached for his personal phone on the bedside table, which had miraculously survived his collapse. He unlocked it with a shaking finger and navigated to a hidden cloud drive. It is not just Jamal, he said, his voice gaining strength. Jamal is an amateur. Your father has been evading federal taxes for 20 years. He uses a shell corporation in Nevada to hide profits and lists them as capital losses. I begged him to stop in the 90s, but he threatened to fire me then too. I kept a duplicate of every real ledger. I have every invoice, every fake receipt, every email instruction he ever sent me. He handed me the phone. It is all there. It is enough to put him away for life. I took the device, feeling the weight of decades of deceit in my hand. My father had destroyed this man's health to save $50,000. In return, Arthur had just handed me the weapon that would cost my father his freedom. I squeezed Arthur's hand. Get some sleep, Mr. Henderson. When you wake up, we have a lot of work to do. While my father was firing an innocent man to cover up a crime, Courtney was busy spending the proceeds of that crime on a celebration of her own vanity. I sat in my hotel room, flanked by Ethan and Arthur, watching a live stream from the garden of my father's estate. Courtney had decided to host an impromptu afternoon high tea for the wives of the city's elite. The theme was ostensibly charity, but the reality was a showcase for the $30,000 Hermes Birkin bag sitting prominently on the center table, surrounded by imported orchids and crystal flutes of champagne. The irony was nauseating. The catering, the flowers, and the vintage champagne were all paid for with the payroll funds stolen from the warehouse workers. I watched on the screen as Courtney floated between tables in a silk dress, laughing artificially, playing the role of the benevolent matriarch. She stopped in front of her phone, which was propped up on a tripod, to address her live audience. She adjusted her hair, checked her angles, and launched into a monologue that was so tone-deaf it belonged in a museum of narcissism. Hi, everyone, Courtney chirped, waving a manicured hand. I just wanted to hop on here and share a little inspiration. I know times are tough for some people, but Jamal and I believe that true abundance comes from a mindset of success. We have been so blessed this quarter, and it just goes to show that if you support your husband and keep your standards high, the universe rewards you. She paused to sip her drink, leaning in closer to the camera, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I was just telling the girls here how important it is to choose the right partner. It breaks my heart to see so many women out there, especially single mothers, who just give up. They wear cheap clothes, they drive rental cars, and they look so bitter. They act like the world owes them a living because they made poor choices. Honestly, it is a liability to be around that kind of negative energy. You have to surround yourself with assets, ladies, not liabilities. I felt a muscle in my jaw jump. She used the exact word my father had used to describe me 9 years ago. Liability. She was talking about me. She was mocking my rental car, my clothes, and my life as a single mother, all while broadcasting from a house that was technically already mine and flaunting a bag bought with stolen money. Arthur let out a low growl from the couch. "She has no idea, does she?" he asked. "She has no idea that the credit card she used to pay the caterer is going to bounce tomorrow. Let her talk," I said, my eyes fixed on the screen. Every word she says is evidence. "Ethan, are you capturing this?" Every second, Ethan confirmed, tapping away at his laptop. She is publicly displaying assets purchased with embezzled funds. In a divorce court or a criminal trial, this video is a confession. She is establishing that she benefited from the crime. Courtney was still talking, holding up the Birkin bag. "This little baby was a gift from Jamal for being such a supportive wife. It is a reminder that you are worth what you demand." I stopped the recording. She was right about one thing. You are worth what you demand. And I was about to demand everything. I picked up my phone and sent a text to the lead auditor, who was scheduled to arrive the next morning. I attached the video file of Courtney's speech. I added a simple caption: "Check the receipt for the bag against the missing payroll transfer." The party was over, even if Courtney didn't know it yet. The second tranche of funding was scheduled to release at 9 a.m. on Friday. At 8:59 a.m. I pressed the abort command on my laptop. It was as simple as turning off a light switch, but the effect on Desmond Logistics was immediate and catastrophic. In his office, my father was hitting the refresh button on his banking portal with a violence that threatened to crack the screen. When the balance remained unchanged, he screamed for his secretary, but she wasn't there. She had walked out an hour ago when her paycheck bounced. Mr. Sterling took the call from my father on speakerphone in my hotel suite. Desmond sounded like a drowning man. He demanded to know where the money was. Sterling, cool as ice, cited Clause 7C of the contract regarding material adverse change in leadership integrity. He mentioned the irregularities in the previous transfer. He didn't say Jamal's name, but he didn't have to. He told Desmond that all further funding was suspended pending a full forensic audit. The line went dead. By noon, the company was not just bleeding, it was in cardiac arrest. Fuel suppliers cut off credit. The insurance on the fleet was canceled for non-payment. The silence in the warehouse was deafening. But desperation breeds delusion. Jamal burst into Desmond's office, waving a heavy cream-colored envelope. It was an invitation to the Midnight Gala, the city's most prestigious charity event for minority-owned businesses. Every heavyweight in Atlanta would be there, including venture capitalists, politicians, and philanthropists. "This is it, Dad," Jamal said, adjusting his silk tie as if appearance could mask the rot underneath. "We go tonight. We work the room. I know Arthur Chen from Chen Capital will be there. We just need one handshake, one bridge loan to replace these Phoenix guys, and we are back in the game." Desmond looked at the invitation like it was a religious relic. He didn't see a party. He saw a hunting ground. He nodded, straightening his spine, convincing himself that his charm could still sell a sinking ship. "Get Courtney," he ordered. "Tell her to wear her best jewelry. We need to look like we own the place." I watched them on the security feed, making plans to con a new victim. They were putting on their tuxedos and polishing their shoes, preparing to walk onto a stage they thought they commanded. They didn't know that I had bought the theater. I picked up my phone and called my stylist. "Bring the red dress," I said, "the one that looks like blood." I was going to the gala, too. And I wasn't going to donate. I was going to foreclose. The midnight gala at the Atlanta History Center was an ocean of diamonds and hypocrisy. The ballroom was transformed into a gilded cage for the city's elite, smelling of expensive perfume and even more expensive secrets. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the ceiling, casting a warm, forgiving light on the aging faces of the titans of industry. I stood on the mezzanine hidden by the shadows of a marble pillar watching the entrance. At exactly 8:15, my family arrived. They stepped out of a stretch limousine that I knew was billed to a corporate account that was currently frozen. Desmond adjusted his tuxedo jacket, puffing out his chest like a peacock trying to intimidate a tiger. He looked the part of the titan he used to be, but from my vantage point, I could see the tremor in his hands. Jamal walked a step behind, his eyes darting around the room, not with confidence, but with the frantic energy of a prey animal looking for an exit. He was sweating through his dress shirt, wiping his forehead with a silk handkerchief every few seconds. And then there was Courtney. She wore a shimmering silver gown that clung to her like a second skin, and on her arm hung the Hermes Birkin bag, the leather trophy she had bought with the livelihoods of 300 workers. She smiled at the photographers posing and preening, oblivious to the fact that the flashbulbs were capturing evidence, not celebrity. They walked into the room expecting the parting of the Red Sea. They expected the hushed whispers of admiration that usually accompanied the arrival of the Desmond clan. Instead, they hit a wall of ice. Desmond spotted Marcus Thorne, the CEO of a rival logistics firm, and a man he had golfed with for decades. Desmond extended his hand, his voice booming a greeting that was too loud for the polite hum of the room. Thorne didn't even break stride. He looked right through my father as if he were made of glass, turned his back, and engaged in a conversation with a waiter. I saw Desmond's smile falter, a crack appearing in the porcelain mask. He tried again with a venture capitalist from New York, a man named Arthur Chen, whom Jamal had pinned his hopes on. Desmond approached him with open arms, ready to pitch the deal of a lifetime. Chen checked his phone, whispered something to his wife, and walked away before Desmond could even finish his sentence. The smell of bankruptcy is distinct in these circles. It smells like desperation, and my family was reeking of it. They didn't know that the rumor mill had already started churning. They didn't know that I had leaked the news of the union strike to the business journals just an hour ago. To everyone in that room, Desmond Logistics wasn't an investment opportunity. It was a contagion. They moved through the crowd, three ghosts haunting a party, where they were no longer welcome, clinking glasses with empty air, their laughter growing shriller and more brittle with every rejection. They were looking for a savior, but they were walking alone in a graveyard of their own making. They were drowning in plain sight, and nobody was going to throw them a rope. The hush that fell over the ballroom was not the polite silence of high society, but the stunned silence of predators recognizing a new apex creature. I stepped through the double mahogany doors wearing a custom crimson gown that looked like liquid fire against my skin. It was cut dangerously low in the back and high on the thigh, a deliberate choice to showcase the strength I had built over years of fighting for survival. I wasn't wearing jewelry. I didn't need to. The dress itself cost more than the combined annual salaries of everyone my father had fired that morning. I walked down the grand staircase, my heels making no sound on the plush carpet. I saw heads turn. I saw whispers ripple through the crowd like a wave. And then I saw them. My family was huddled near the back of the room, clutching their drinks, as if they were life preservers. Courtney was the first to spot me. Her eyes widened, scanning me from head to toe, her brain short-circuiting as it tried to reconcile the struggling single mother she despised with the vision walking toward the VIP section. She grabbed Jamal's arm, her fingernails digging into his tuxedo jacket. "What is she doing here?" she hissed loud enough for me to hear from 10 feet away. "Did she sneak in through the kitchen? Is she working catering?" I didn't acknowledge her. I kept walking, my gaze fixed on the platinum circle, the roped-off area right in front of the stage, reserved for the city's billionaires. As I reached the velvet rope, Courtney moved. She couldn't help herself. Her need to humiliate me was a compulsion stronger than her survival instinct. She stepped directly into my path, blocking my way with a smug, tight-lipped smile. "You are lost," Sweetie Courtney said, her voice dripping with faux concern. The staff entrance is around the back. This area is for guests with invitations. And I am pretty sure they don't sell tickets to people who drive rental cars. I looked down at her. Up close, I could see the cracks in her foundation makeup and the fear behind her eyes. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm and imperious. "You are in my way." Courtney laughed, a shrill sound that drew the attention of the nearby security guard. "Oh, I don't think so. I am saving you from embarrassment, Aaliyah. You don't belong here. You never have." She turned and waved frantically at a large man in a black suit standing by the pillar. "Officer, over here, please. We have a crasher. This woman is harassing my family and trying to enter the VIP section without a ticket." The guard, a man named Roberts, whom I had personally vetted for my security detail 3 years ago, started walking toward us. Courtney beamed, crossing her arms over her chest, triumphant. She looked at me with pure malice. "They are going to drag you out, Aaliyah," she whispered. "And I am going to record every second of it for my followers. This is what happens when liabilities try to act like assets." I stood perfectly still, clutching my clutch, which contained the deed to her house. I watched Roberts approach, his face stern. Courtney thought she was summoning her protector. She had no idea she was summoning my employee. The trap was set, and she had just walked right into the center of the cage. Roberts, the head of security, was 6 feet 4 inches of muscle wrapped in a black suit. To Courtney, he was a servant she could command with a snap of her fingers. To me, he was a loyal employee I had personally hired to overhaul the security protocols for all Phoenix Holdings assets. He walked toward us with a heavy, purposeful stride, his earpiece coiled against his neck. Courtney smirked, stepping back to give him room to grab me. She crossed her arms, waiting for the humiliating spectacle of seeing me dragged away. "Officer, remove her," Courtney commanded, pointing a manicured finger at my face. "She is trespassing." Robert stopped directly in front of me. He ignored Courtney completely, as if she were a gnat buzzing in his ear. He looked me in the eye, straightened his tie, and bowed his head slightly. It was a gesture of deferential respect that silenced the immediate area. "Good evening, Madam Chairwoman," Roberts said, his voice deep and clear. "We were not expecting you until later. I have already cleared the path to Table 1. The mayor is waiting for you." He reached out and unhooked the heavy velvet rope, stepping aside to usher me into the sanctuary of the Platinum Circle. The silence that followed was absolute. Courtney's smirk fell off her face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion. She looked at Roberts, then at me, then back at Roberts. Her brain was misfiring, unable to process the title he had just used. Chairwoman. It was a word that implied power, ownership, and authority, 3 things she was convinced I did not possess. Jamal stepped forward, his voice cracking. "Wait a minute. You made a mistake, pal. She is nobody." "What did you just call her?" Roberts turned his cold gaze to Jamal. "I addressed her by her title, sir." "Now step back. You are crowding the VIP entrance." Jamal stumbled back as if he had been pushed. He looked at me, his eyes searching for an explanation. But then I saw the shift. I saw the moment their prejudice overrode their logic. They couldn't accept that I was the boss. That would mean admitting they were wrong. That would mean admitting I was superior, so they invented a reality that comforted them. Courtney let out a sharp, breathless laugh. "Oh my God, I get it now." She stepped closer to me, her confidence rushing back in a toxic wave. She looked at my dress, then at the empty seat at the head table, and shook her head with a look of mock pity. "Chairwoman," she repeated, sneering the word. "That is cute, Aaliyah. Is that what he calls you? The old man who bought you that dress? Is that his little pet name for his mistress?" She turned to Jamal, whispering loudly. "She is banging the owner. Jamal. That is how she got in. She found some senile billionaire on his deathbed and seduced him." That explains the dress. That explains the attitude. She didn't earn a seat at the table. She slept her way to it. Courtney looked back at me, her eyes gleaming with malice. "I hope he has a strong heart, sweetie. It would be a shame if he died before he signed the check. But I guess that is one way to pay the rent." "Go ahead. Go sit on his lap. We will be over here with the decent people who actually work for a living. I didn't correct her. I didn't defend my honor. I simply smiled, walked past the velvet rope, and entered the circle of power. Let them think I was a mistress. It would make the moment I fired them infinitely more painful. The lights in the ballroom dimmed, focusing a single spotlight on the stage, where a curator unveiled the centerpiece of the evening. It was a breathtaking oil painting titled The Storm, depicting a solitary black woman standing amidst a tempest, her head held high against the driving rain. The irony was not lost on me. It was a mirror of my own life, a masterpiece capturing the very resilience my family lacked. The auctioneer, a man with a clipped British accent, started the bidding at $5,000. The room was polite, but hesitant. Most people were keeping their paddles down, sensing the tension in the air. But Jamal saw an opportunity. He was desperate to prove that he belonged, desperate to erase the memory of the security guard blocking his path. He needed a win, no matter the cost. He shot a glance at the table where the venture capitalists were sitting, straightened his tie, and thrust his paddle into the air with aggressive force. $10,000, Jamal shouted, his voice cracking slightly under the strain. He looked around the room, beaming, expecting applause. He turned to Courtney, who squeezed his arm, whispering validation into his ear. She looked at me across the room, her eyes saying, "See, we still have power." The auctioneer nodded. "I have $10,000 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 12,000?" Silence stretched across the room. Jamal's smile widened. He thought he had won. He thought he was about to walk away with the prize, reinforcing the illusion of his wealth. He was already rehearsing his victory speech to the press. I finished my glass of sparkling water and set it down on the table. I didn't look at Jamal. I looked directly at the painting. I picked up my paddle number 001 and held it up without standing. $100,000, I said. My voice was not loud, but in the acoustics of the ballroom it sounded like a thunderclap. The auctioneer froze. The murmur of the crowd died instantly. 300 heads turned in unison toward the platinum circle. Jamal's jaw dropped. The smile slid off his face like oil. He blinked rapidly as if trying to clear a hallucination. Desmond, standing beside him, looked as if he had been punched in the gut. $100,000, the auctioneer repeated, his professional composure momentarily shaken. The bid is with the chairwoman at table 1. I could feel the heat of their stares. Jamal looked at his father, panic rising in his eyes. He realized in that terrifying moment that I wasn't playing the same game. He was playing checkers with borrowed pieces, and I was playing chess with a board I owned. He wanted to raise his hand. I could see the impulse twitching in his arm, the desperate need to outdo me. But he knew. He knew his credit cards were maxed out. He knew the company accounts were frozen. He knew that if he bid $1 more, he would be exposed as a fraud before the gavel even hit the wood. Going once, the auctioneer called out, looking directly at Jamal, challenging him. Jamal lowered his head. He lowered his paddle. He shrank into his tuxedo, defeated by the sheer weight of my capital. "Sold," the auctioneer shouted, slamming the gavel down. "To the lady in red for $100,000. The room erupted in polite applause. I didn't smile. I simply nodded to the auctioneer. I had just bought a painting for the price of a luxury car, not because I needed art, but because I needed to show them the difference between net worth and self-worth. I had the former. They had neither. The applause for my victory was like acid on Jamal's skin. He could not stand it. He could not stand the way the room looked at me with respect, and at him with pity. Logic abandoned him completely. The survival instinct that had kept him quiet a moment ago was drowned out by a roar of masculine insecurity. He looked at Courtney, who was glaring at him with disappointment, and something inside him snapped. He ignored the fact that he was broke. He ignored the fact that his accounts were frozen. He just needed to win. 110,000, Jamal screamed, thrusting his paddle into the air like a weapon. The room gasped. Even Desmond grabbed his arm, his eyes wide with terror, hissing at him to stop. but Jamal shook him off, stepping away from his father. He stared right at me, a manic grin plastered on his sweating face. He thought he had checkmated me. He thought this was a poker game where he could bluff his way to the pot, assuming I would back down to save him from embarrassment. He was wrong. The auctioneer paused. He looked at Jamal, then at the digital tablet on his podium. He adjusted his glasses, his expression shifting from professional to skeptical. He tapped his microphone, the feedback whining slightly. "Sir," the auctioneer said, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "For unverified floor bids exceeding $100,000, house policy requires immediate credit verification. Please present your payment method to the floor manager, standing to your right." A hush fell over the room. This was a direct challenge to Jamal's solvency. A smart man would have laughed it off and withdrawn the bid. Jamal was not a smart man. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out his black corporate American Express card. He handed it to the floor manager with a sneer, playing the role of the offended billionaire to the bitter end. "Run it," Jamal said, his voice loud enough for the front row to hear. "And then bring me my painting." The floor manager, a young woman with a portable chip reader, took the card. She didn't step away. She inserted the card right there under the spotlight. The device let out a soft beep as it processed the request. The seconds stretched out into hours. Jamal tapped his foot, looking around the room with arrogant defiance. Then a sharp, dissonant buzz echoed through the ballroom. It was the digital sound of rejection amplified by the silence. The floor manager looked at the screen, frowned, and tried again. Another buzz. She looked up at the auctioneer and shook her head. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "I apologize, sir," he announced, his voice devoid of sympathy. "The card has been declined. The bank code indicates a hard freeze on all associated assets due to insufficient funds and fraud alerts." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Declined. Insufficient funds. Fraud. Every head in the room turned to stare at Jamal. He stood there, his hand still extended to take back the card, his face draining of color until he looked like a wax figure. He tried to laugh, to make a joke, to claim it was a bank error, but his voice failed him. Courtney took a sharp step away from him, physically distancing herself from the failure, her eyes fixed on the floor. Desmond covered his face with his hand. Jamal Desmond had just been stripped naked in front of the very people he tried so desperately to impress. I took a slow sip of my champagne, watching the life leave his eyes. He wasn't just broke, he was broken. The heavy oak door of the ladies' restroom swung shut behind me, cutting off the hum of the ballroom and the fresh scent of Jamal's public execution. The room was an oasis of silence, tiled in Italian marble and lit by soft, flattering sconces. I walked to the sink and turned on the gold faucet, letting the cool water run over my wrists. I looked at myself in the mirror. I did not look like a woman who had just destroyed her brother. I looked like a woman who was just getting started. The door burst open with a violence that rattled the frames of the mirrors. Courtney stormed in, her chest heaving, her silver dress looking less like armor and more like a costume she was desperate to shed. She saw me and stopped dead, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure, unadulterated hatred. She checked the stalls to ensure we were alone. When she saw the room was empty, she lunged at me. "You bitch!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the tile. "You did this. You froze the accounts. You rigged the auction!" She marched toward me, her heels clicking like gunshots on the floor. "Do you have any idea what you have done? You humiliated us. You humiliated me. I have to walk back out there and face those people because of you." She raised her hand, aiming a sharp, vicious slap at my face. It was a clumsy move born of hysteria rather than skill. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I simply reached up and caught her wrist mid-swing. My grip was steel. I squeezed just hard enough to let her know that the physical power dynamic was just as lopsided as the financial one. Courtney gasped, trying to yank her hand back, but I held fast. I pulled her a step closer, invading her personal space until I could smell the expensive champagne on her breath and the fear radiating from her pores. "Let go of me," she hissed, struggling uselessly against my hold. I leaned in, bringing my lips close to her ear, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. I suggest you calm down, Courtney. Unless you want the auditors to look at your personal expenses next. She froze. Her eyes darted to mine, wide and terrified. What are you talking about? I smiled, cold and sharp. I am talking about Marcus. Your personal trainer. The one you see 3 times a week at the Equinox in Buckhead. Courtney went still. Her face drained of all color, leaving her rouge standing out like a bruise on her cheek. I know about the private sessions. I continued, tightening my grip on her wrist. I know about the weekend trip to Cabo that you told Jamal was a spa retreat with your sister. And most importantly, Courtney, I know exactly how you paid for it. You didn't use your allowance. You used the corporate expense account under the label Vendor Relations. She started to tremble. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. That is embezzlement, Courtney, I said, releasing her wrist with a shove that sent her stumbling back against the counter. That is a federal crime. Jamal is going down for gambling with company funds, but you are going to prison for stealing payroll money to pay a gigolo. Courtney clutched her wrist, staring at me with horror. Please, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jamal, he would kill me. I picked up my clutch and checked my reflection one last time. I don't care what Jamal does, but if you ever raise your hand to me again, I will send the receipts to your husband, and I will send the photos of you and Marcus to the police. Now fix your face. You look guilty. I turned and walked out of the restroom, leaving her clinging to the marble sink for support, gasping for air in the ruins of her own secrets. She had walked in to assault me. She was left wondering if she would survive the night. I stepped out of the restroom, the heavy door clicking shut behind me, effectively silencing Courtney's whimpers. The corridor was dimly lit, a service hallway lined with potted ferns and shadowed alcoves designed for private conversations away from the prying eyes of the press. I didn't get 3 steps before a heavy hand clamped down on my upper arm. It was a grip I remembered from childhood, a grip meant to bruise and control. I didn't flinch. I stopped walking and looked at the hand, then slowly traveled my gaze up the tuxedo sleeve to meet the bloodshot eyes of my father. Desmond pulled me roughly into the shadows of a recessed archway. He smelled of stale scotch and fear. The facade of the confident tycoon had completely dissolved. His tie was crooked, sweat beaded on his upper lip, and he was breathing hard like a bull that had been chased into a corner by a pack of wolves. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and rage, trying to reconcile the daughter he had discarded with the woman who had just publicly castrated his son. What the hell is going on? Desmond snarled, his voice a low, vibrating growl. I saw you. I saw you bid. Where did you get that kind of money? And don't lie to me about finance. You are doing this, aren't you? The frozen accounts, the bank audit, the Phoenix loan. It is all you. He tightened his grip, shaking me slightly. You are trying to ruin me. You are trying to destroy this family. Is that it? You want revenge because I kicked you out. You are willing to burn down my legacy just to throw a tantrum. I looked at him calmly, my expression devoid of any emotion. I didn't pull away. I didn't struggle. I simply stared at him until the silence became uncomfortable. I waited until he realized that his physical strength meant nothing to me anymore. I was not the scared teenager on the porch. I was the one holding the deed to the building we were standing in. You are confused, Desmond. I said, my voice smooth and cold as polished glass. I am not destroying your legacy. You destroyed it yourself years ago. I am just the foreclosure agent. Desmond released my arm as if burned. He stepped back, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. You are sick, he hissed. You are a traitor. I will call the police. I will tell them you hacked our accounts. I will have you thrown in jail before sunrise. I laughed, a soft, dry sound. You can certainly try, Dad. But considering your son just committed wire fraud on a live transaction and your daughter-in-law is embezzling company funds to pay her lover, I don't think inviting the police into your life is a wise strategic move. Desmond froze. The color drained from his face. He opened his mouth to speak to deny it, but the truth was written in the hard lines of my face. He knew I wasn't bluffing. He looked suddenly old a man, realizing he was standing on a trapdoor that had already opened. I checked my watch. It was late. I had appointments to keep. "I am done playing games," I said, stepping out of the shadows and smoothing my dress. "The board meeting is scheduled for tomorrow morning. I expect you, Jamal, and Courtney to be there." Desmond stared at me, his hands trembling. "Board meeting." "We don't have a board meeting. You do now," I replied, turning to walk away. 8 a.m. sharp. Desmond, in the main conference room. "Do not be late, and do not make me wait. If you are not in that room when I walk in, I will have the marshals evict you from the estate by noon." "Sleep well, Dad." I walked down the hallway, the sound of my heels echoing in the silence. I didn't look back. I left him standing in the dark, a king without a kingdom, waiting for the sun to rise on his execution. The morning sun did not bring warmth to the Desmond estate. It brought a cold gray light that exposed the cracks in the veneer of their lives. The house was silent. The staff had not returned, the kitchen was cold, and the coffee machine sat unused. Desmond sat at the head of the long dining table, still wearing the tuxedo trousers from the night before, his shirt unbuttoned and stained with sweat. He stared at the wall, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. Jamal sat across from him, head in his hands, nursing a migraine that throbbed in time with his mounting panic. Courtney was nowhere to be seen, likely hiding in the guest room, terrified to face the husband she had betrayed. At 7:15 a.m. the doorbell rang. It was not the melodic chime of a social call. It was a sharp, insistent buzz that demanded attention. Desmond didn't move. Jamal groaned and pushed himself up, shambling to the foyer. He opened the heavy door to find a man in a nondescript windbreaker holding a thick manila envelope. The man didn't smile. He didn't ask how they were doing. He simply asked for Desmond. Desmond. Jamal pointed to the dining room. The man walked in, tossed the envelope onto the table in front of my father, and said 3 words that ended their world. "You have been served." Desmond stared at the package. He opened it with trembling fingers. It wasn't a letter. It was a court order, a temporary restraining order on all personal and corporate assets, a notice of foreclosure proceedings, a mandate for an immediate forensic audit. The Phoenix Group had petitioned the court at dawn, citing fraud and breach of contract. The judge, likely nudged by the mountain of evidence I had provided, had signed it immediately. They were locked out of their own bank accounts. They couldn't buy a loaf of bread, let alone save a company. "We have to go." Desmond whispered, his voice raspy. She said, 8 a.m. "We have to be there." They piled into Jamal's car, the only vehicle with a full tank of gas. The drive to the industrial district was a funeral procession of one. No one spoke. The radio was off. The city of Atlanta rushed by outside the windows, a world that was moving on without them. Desmond clutched the court papers in his lap, reading the same lines over and over, trying to find a loophole that didn't exist. When they turned the corner onto the street that housed the Desmond Logistics headquarters, the car slowed to a crawl. Jamal slammed on the brakes, his mouth falling open. Desmond looked up, and the color drained from his face completely. There were 2 utility trucks parked on the lawn. A crane was extended high into the air, its hydraulic arm reaching toward the roof of the main office building. 2 men in neon vests were up there with angle grinders and crowbars. Sparks showered down like fireworks in the morning light as they cut through the steel bolts that held the massive letters of the company name in place. As Desmond watched, paralyzed with horror, the letter D detached from the wall. It hung suspended for a moment, a rusted symbol of his ego, before being lowered slowly to the ground, where it was unceremoniously dumped into a pile of scrap metal. They weren't just seizing the company, they were erasing him. The sign was coming down. The legacy was over. And inside the building, sitting in his chair, was the woman who had ordered the demolition. The walk to the executive suite felt like a march to the gallows. The hallway was stripped bare. The framed photographs of Desmond shaking hands with senators and mayors were gone. leaving only pale, dusty rectangles on the faded wallpaper. The silence was absolute. There were no phones ringing, no chatter from the break room, no hum of productivity. The building was a tomb, and my family was walking toward the burial chamber. Desmond led the way, his breathing ragged and shallow. He reached the double mahogany doors of the boardroom, the doors he had walked through 1,000 times as a king. Today, he hesitated. Roberts, the head of security, stood guard. He didn't bow this time. He simply opened the door and gestured for them to enter. The room was freezing. The blinds were drawn, casting the long table in a twilight gloom. At the far end, 3 figures were waiting. On the left sat Ethan. He didn't look up as they entered. He was methodically arranging a stack of legal documents, his pen scratching against the paper with a rhythmic, maddening sound. Desmond stopped, his jaw dropping. "Ethan." Desmond croaked, his voice cracking. "What are you doing here? You work for me. Get over here and explain this legal mess." Ethan ignored him completely. He turned a page and continued writing. Desmond's eyes traveled to the right. There, sitting comfortably with a cup of tea, was a ghost. Arthur Henderson, the old accountant whom Desmond had fired and left to die on the rug just 2 days ago, looked healthier than he had in years. He was wearing a sharp new suit. He looked at Desmond not with fear but with a calm, pitying smile. And in the center at the head of the table sat the chairwoman. But Desmond could not see her face. The high-backed leather executive chair, his chair was turned away, facing the window that overlooked the city skyline. All they could see was the back of the black leather and a hand resting on the armrest, tapping a gold pen against the upholstery. "Who are you?" Desmond demanded, trying to summon the last shreds of his authority. "Turn around. I demand to speak to the owner of Phoenix Holdings. I want to know who is behind this hostile takeover." The tapping stopped. The room held its breath. Then, with a low, smooth hydraulic hum, the chair began to rotate. It moved slowly, deliberately, prolonging the tension until the very last second. As the chair completed its turn, I came into view. I was not wearing the red dress from the gala, nor the cheap clothes from the rental car. I was wearing a bespoke black power suit tailored to perfection. My hair was pulled back, my expression made of stone. I looked at my father, my brother, and my sister-in-law with the cold detachment of a coroner examining a corpse. Desmond staggered back as if he had been shot. He grabbed the edge of the table to keep from falling. His face went from pale to a sickly shade of gray. He looked at me, then at Arthur, then back at me. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in his mind with terrifying clarity. The risk management book, the warnings, the knowledge of the accounts, the name of the company Phoenix, the bird that rises from the ashes. "You." Desmond whispered, the air leaving his lungs. "It is you. You are Phoenix." I placed the gold pen on the table with a soft click. I leaned forward, locking eyes with the man who had thrown me out like trash 9 years ago. "Hello, Dad," I said softly. "Please take a seat. We have a lot of paperwork to get through." I did not wait for them to process the shock. I picked up a sleek black remote from the table and pressed a button. The overhead lights dimmed, plunging the room into a semi-darkness, illuminated only by the cold blue glow of the projection screen descending from the ceiling. Desmond and Jamal sat paralyzed like deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. Courtney stood near the door, clutching her purse, calculating if she could run fast enough to escape the blast radius. "Please look at the screen," I said, my voice cutting through the gloom. "Since you are so fond of numbers, Dad, I thought we should review the quarterly performance. But not the fake one you show the board. The real one." I clicked the remote. Slide 1 appeared. It was a complex forensic flowchart, but the focal point was a thick red line tracing funds leaving the corporate accounts and ending up in personal pockets. "Exhibit A," I announced, pointing the laser pointer at the jagged red peak. "Unauthorized capital extraction. Over the last 18 months, $2.4 million has been siphoned from the operating budget. It was labeled as consulting fees and logistical overages." I turned to look at Jamal. He was shrinking in his seat, sweat glistening on his forehead. The money didn't go to consultants, Jamal, I continued. It went to online gambling platforms, luxury car leases, and a particularly expensive jewelry store in Buckhead. You didn't just skim the top, you gutted the hull. That is 20 years of federal prison time, right there on the screen. Jamal opened his mouth to protest, to lie, but I clicked the button again. The screen shifted. Slide 2 was a scanned document, old and yellowed, juxtaposed with a digital spreadsheet. Exhibit B, I said, turning my gaze to Desmond. Tax evasion. Specifically, the utilization of a shell corporation in Nevada called Desmond Holdings LLC to hide profits and manufacture losses. You have been doing this for 20 years, Dad. You thought because you fired Arthur, the paper trail disappeared. But you forgot that Arthur kept copies. Arthur Henderson took a sip of his tea, looking at Desmond over the rim of his cup with a satisfied expression. Desmond looked at his former accountant, his face a mask of betrayal. You gave her the books, he whispered. I gave her the truth, Arthur replied calmly. I clicked the remote a final time. Slide 3 appeared. It was the simplest slide of all. It showed a scanned image of a bank transfer confirmation and a legal deed of assignment from City National Bank. And finally, Exhibit C, I said, stepping away from the head of the table to stand directly in front of them. This is the purchase agreement for your corporate debt. When the bank froze your assets yesterday, they panicked. They classified your loans as toxic. They were desperate to unload the risk. So I made them an offer. I bought your entire debt portfolio this morning for 30 cents on the dollar. The room went deathly silent. Desmond stared at the screen, his mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the trap. Do you understand what this means, Desmond? I asked, leaning down so our faces were inches apart. The bank doesn't own you anymore. The investors don't own you. I own you. I am the sole holder of every mortgage, every lien, and every loan attached to this company and your personal estate. I am your only creditor. And unlike the bank, I am not interested in a payment plan. I am calling in the debt. In full. Today. The silence in the boardroom was heavy, suffocating, broken only by the hum of the projector fan. I walked over to the stack of documents Ethan had prepared and picked up the first folder. It was thin, lightweight, but it held the weight of a life sentence. I slid it across the polished mahogany table toward Jamal. He looked at it, then up at me, his eyes wet with fear. Let's start with you, brother, I said, my voice devoid of warmth. You have two options. Option A is simple. I hand the forensic audit to the FBI. You go to federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. You will likely serve 15 to 20 years. Jamal flinched. He looked at his father for help, but Desmond was staring at the table, a broken man. Option B, I continued. You sign this document. It is a full confession and a voluntary renunciation of your inheritance. You surrender your shares, your trust fund, and your position in the company. In exchange, I will decline to press criminal charges. However, there is a condition. You will plead guilty to a misdemeanor and complete 2,000 hours of community service, specifically cleaning litter off the highway. Jamal stared at the pen. He looked at his tuxedo, then at the document. He didn't hesitate. He didn't fight for his honor or his father's legacy. He grabbed the pen and scribbled his signature, choosing survival over dignity. I snatched the paper away before the ink was dry. Smart choice, I said. Now get out of my sight. But before you go, you might want to see what your wife has been up to while you were stealing to buy her handbags. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick envelope. I tossed it onto the table in front of Jamal. The photos spilled out. High-definition shots of Courtney and Marcus, her personal trainer, intimate and undeniable, taken on the balcony of a hotel in Cabo. Jamal froze. He picked up a photo, his hands shaking violently. He looked at Courtney, who had turned a ghostly shade of white. You used the payroll money, Jamal whispered, his voice rising to a scream. You let me steal from the company. You let me risk jail to pay for him. Courtney backed away, shaking her head. Jamal, listen to me. It is not what it looks like. Jamal lunged at her, but Robert stepped in, blocking him with a massive arm. I watched the implosion with cold satisfaction. Their marriage was built on greed, and it had just collapsed under the weight of the truth. Enough, I commanded. Roberts removed them both. They can discuss the divorce settlement in the parking lot. As my brother and his wife were dragged out screaming at each other, the room fell silent again. Only Desmond remained. He looked small in the big leather chair. He looked old. I walked over to the window and opened the blinds, letting the harsh morning light flood the room. I turned to face him. "You lost the company, Desmond," I said quietly. "You lost the house. You lost your son. And now you have lost your honor. The eviction notice for the estate has already been filed. You have 1 hour to pack your personal effects. Do not take anything of value. The paintings, the watches, the cars, they belong to Phoenix Holdings now." Desmond looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. "Aaliyah, please. I am your father. Where will I go?" I looked at him, remembering the cold night 9 years ago when I asked him the same question. I remembered the closed door. I remembered the silence. "I don't know, Dad," I said, turning my back on him. "But I hear the homeless shelter downtown is open until noon. I suggest you hurry. You don't want to miss the bus." The transition of power was not marked by a bang, but by the steady, rhythmic sound of construction crews dismantling the past. 6 weeks had passed since the boardroom coup, and the landscape of my life had been altered beyond recognition. The towering sign of Desmond Logistics was gone, replaced by the sleek silver falcon of Phoenix Global. The company was no longer a kingdom of fear ruled by a tyrant. It was a well-oiled machine where the drivers were paid on time, the fleet was insured, and Arthur Henderson sat in the CFO's office, finally receiving the respect he had earned 40 years ago. Jamal was currently serving his community service hours on the side of Interstate 85, wearing a neon orange vest that matched the humiliation burning in his gut. Courtney had fled to her sister's couch in Savannah, her reputation in Atlanta society reduced to a cautionary tale about greed. But the true victory was not in the boardroom, it was at the estate. I stood on the balcony of the master bedroom, the very room where my father used to sleep, and looked out over the sprawling grounds. I had not moved in. I had no desire to sleep in a bed that smelled of his cologne and his cruelty. Instead, I had repurposed the entire property. The heavy, oppressive velvet drapes were gone, replaced by sheer linen that let the sunlight flood in. The dark mahogany furniture, which had absorbed decades of angry whispers and cigar smoke, had been auctioned off, the proceeds donated to charity. The house felt lighter. It felt like it could finally breathe. I walked down the grand staircase, my hand trailing along the banister. Today was the grand opening. I had renamed the estate the Haven. It was no longer a monument to one man's ego. It was a sanctuary for the very people my father and Courtney had despised. It was a transitional housing center and business incubator for single mothers. Women who had been cast aside, women who had been told they were liabilities, would come here to learn coding, finance, and entrepreneurship. They would live here with their children, safe and supported, until they were ready to build empires of their own. The downstairs foyer, once a cold and forbidding space where I had been turned away, was now filled with the sound of laughter. Children were running through the halls, their footsteps echoing on the marble, not as a disturbance but as a melody. Leo was in the center of it all, sitting on the floor of the living room, showing a group of younger kids how to build a complex structure out of Legos. He looked up at me and smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. He knew we had won. He knew we were safe. I walked out onto the front porch, the same porch where I had stood 9 years ago with a suitcase and a broken heart. The air was crisp and clean. The landscaping crew had removed the intimidating iron spikes from the perimeter fence, replacing them with softer, welcoming greenery, though the security gate remained formidable. It was a necessary barrier between the peace we had built inside and the chaos of the world outside. As I stood there drinking in the sight of the renovated garden, a movement at the main gate caught my eye. A figure was standing on the other side of the wrought iron bars, clutching the metal rails with weathered hands. I walked down the stone path, my heels clicking softly, my posture straight and unyielding. As I got closer, the figure resolved into clarity. It was Desmond. He looked like a shadow of the man he had been. The bespoke suits were gone, replaced by a rumpled jacket that was 2 sizes too big and stained at the cuffs. His hair, once dyed and coiffed, was gray and thinning. He had lost weight, his face gaunt and hollow, the arrogance scrubbed away by the harsh grit of reality. He was living in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, surviving on a meager pension that I had graciously allowed him to keep, a final act of mercy he probably didn't deserve. He watched me approach, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and confusion. He looked past me at the house, at the brightly colored banner hanging over the entrance that read, "The Haven Building Futures." He heard the sound of children playing. He saw the women sitting on the veranda working on laptops, drinking coffee, living the life he had denied me. "Aaliyah," he crooned, his voice cracking. It sounded foreign, stripped of its boom and bluster. You did all this?" I stopped 10 feet from the gate. I didn't unlock it. I didn't invite him in. I simply stood there, a guardian of the sanctuary. "Yes, Desmond. I did." He gripped the bars tighter. "It looks different. I heard you are letting people live here for free. Strangers." He paused, swallowing hard. "I am your father, Aaliyah. I am living in a place with roaches. I built this house. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" I looked at him, searching for any spark of anger inside myself, but I found none. The anger had burned out, leaving only a cool, indifferent clarity. "You built a house, Desmond." I corrected him gently. "I built a home. And you are right, you are my father. That is why I made sure you have a roof over your head and food to eat. That is more than you offered me when I was pregnant and homeless." He slumped against the gate, defeat radiating off him in waves. Can I come in? Just for a minute, I want to see the library. I want to see Leo." I looked back at the house. Leo had come out onto the porch. He was watching us, his expression curious but unafraid. He didn't recognize the old man at the gate. To Leo, Desmond was just a stranger, a ghost from a story he barely remembered. I turned back to Desmond. I shook my head slowly. "No, you cannot come in. This place is for people who are looking to build a future, Desmond. You are stuck in the past. And frankly, you are a liability we cannot afford." I pressed the button on the remote in my pocket. The heavy electronic gate began to slide shut, the gears humming with a finality that echoed in the quiet street. Desmond stepped back, watching the barrier close between us. He didn't scream. He didn't fight. He just stood there, a small gray man on the sidewalk, watching the kingdom he had forfeited disappear behind the steel. The gate clicked shut. The lock engaged with a heavy thud. I turned around and walked back toward the house, toward the warmth and the light. Leo ran down the steps to meet me, grabbing my hand. He looked toward the gate where the shadow of the man was still lingering, and then looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes. "Who was that, Mom?" Leo asked, tilting his head. I looked down at my son, the boy who was the reason for everything. I squeezed his hand, feeling the strength and the promise in his grip. I smiled, and it was a smile of pure, unadulterated peace. That I said, my voice steady and light. "That was just an old acquaintance, Leo. He is the man who taught me the most important lesson of my life." Leo blinked. "What lesson?" I looked back at the closed gate one last time, then turned my face toward the sun. "He taught me exactly what I am worth," I said. And then I walked my son inside, and we closed the door on the cold, quiet world outside, leaving the past exactly where it belonged. The saga of Aaliyah and the Desmond family serves as a visceral reminder that true power is never inherited. It is earned through resilience and integrity. Desmond and Jamal operated on the fragile currency of ego, believing that their status exempted them from consequences. They mistook arrogance for strength and cruelty for leadership, failing to realize that a legacy built on the suffering of others is destined to collapse. Conversely, Aaliyah demonstrates that liability is often just a label used by those who are intimidated by your potential. She did not let her family's rejection define her worth. Instead, she used it as fuel to forge an undeniable competence. Her journey proves that the most effective revenge is not petty retaliation, but absolute success. By transforming the site of her trauma into a sanctuary for others, she showed that true wealth isn't about the assets you hoard, but the impact you create. When you anchor your value in what you can do rather than what you have, you become untouchable. Are you letting the opinions of others dictate your value? Stop waiting for an invitation to the table, build your own, and don't be afraid to lock the gate on those who didn't believe in you.